Widowed Lumberjack rescued a girl from the snow, and she called him Daddy. The Montana wilderness had been Eli Turner's only companion for 5 winters now. At 68, his hands were still strong enough to split wood, but his heart had been cleaved in two the day Martha passed. The mountain cabin they'd built together 40 years ago now echoed with silence, filled only with memories and the mournful song of wind through the pines. That February morning dawned colder than most. Eli pulled on his thick wool coat and stepped outside to check his trap lines, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The snow lay deep and undisturbed, save for the tracks of deer and rabbits that crisscrossed through the forest. But near the frozen river, something made him stop. Small footprints. The footprints were too small for any animal he knew. The footprints were too small for any adult to recognize. His weathered face creased with concern as he followed the tiny tracks along the riverbank. They wavered and stumbled, sometimes disappearing where the child must have fallen, only to continue again a few feet away. His pace quickened, old joints protesting against the deep snow. He found her beneath a fallen pine, curled into herself like a wounded fawn. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her dark hair was stiff with frost, her lips tinged blue, and in her arms she clutched a ragged cloth doll. She was barely breathing. "Lord have mercy," Eli whispered, immediately shrugging off his heavy coat. He wrapped it around the child and lifted her into his arms. She weighed no more than a sack of flour, and her skin felt like ice against his chest. The trek back to the cabin seemed endless. Ellis's old heart hammered as he pushed through the snow, the girl limp in his arms. He kicked open the door and rushed to the fireplace, where embers still glowed from the morning fire. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured, laying her on the rug before the hearth. His hands, so used to rough work, moved with surprising gentleness as he built up the fire and fetched Martha's quilt from the cedar chest, the last one she'd ever made, with its pattern of interlocking stars. For 3 days and nights, Eli barely left her side. He spooned warm broth between her lips, kept the fire blazing, and talked to her in the same soft voice he'd once used with injured animals. He told her about the mountains, about the eagles that nested in the tall pines, and about anything that might reach through the fog of her fever. On the 4th morning, her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of spring violets, wide and wary as they took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Easy now," Eli said gently, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. You're in my cabin. I found you by the river." She said nothing, only pulled the doll closer to her chest. Eli didn't push. He'd learned patience from mountains, from waiting for seasons to change and wounds to heal. He brought her soup and crackers, leaving them within reach before retreating to his chair by the window. Days passed in quiet routine. The girl watched him with those violet eyes, saying nothing but slowly accepting the food he offered. Eli gave her space, busying himself with his usual tasks, while keeping one eye on his unexpected guest. He carved a small wooden bird while she watched from beneath the quilt. He hummed the old hymns Martha used to sing while cooking their simple meals. Gradually, she began to thaw, not just her body, but something deeper. She started sitting up, then standing, then following him with tentative steps as he moved about the cabin. Still, she didn't speak. Eli didn't mind the silence. After 5 years of talking to shadows, her quiet presence felt like a blessing. He showed her how to feed the fire and how to identify the different bird calls that filtered through the windows. When he sat in his rocker to whittle, she'd settle on the rug at his feet, playing silently with her doll. 2 weeks after he'd found her, a late winter storm rolled in. The wind, howling like a living creature, piled snow against the windows. That night, for the first time, the girl looked frightened. When Eli rose to add wood to the fire, she grabbed the hem of his flannel shirt. "I'm not going anywhere," he assured her, "just keeping us warm." That night, he made her a proper bed near the fire, piling blankets and pillows into a cozy nest. As he tucked Martha's star quilt around her small form, she reached out and caught his weathered hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. Then, softer still, "Daddy." Eli froze. The word hit him like a physical blow, cracking something open inside his chest. He'd never been a father. He and Martha had wanted children and prayed for them, but it wasn't meant to be. Now here was this lost child, calling him by a name he'd never thought to hear. His eyes burned with unshed tears as he gently squeezed her small hand. "You're welcome, sweetheart," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. She fell asleep still holding his hand, and Eli sat there on the floor beside her, watching the firelight dance across her peaceful face. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The silence that had pressed down on him for 5 years had lifted, replaced by the soft breathing of a sleeping child. He thought of Martha, of how she would have loved this little girl. He could almost hear her voice in the wind. "Love finds a way, Eli. It always finds a way." As the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall, Eli Turner made a decision. He didn't know where she'd come from or why she'd been alone in the forest. Tomorrow, when the storm cleared, he'd have to go to town, ask questions, and fill out papers. But tonight, in this moment, none of that mattered. She had found a home in his cabin, warm and safe from the cold. And he had found something he'd thought was lost forever, a reason to wake up each morning, a purpose beyond mere survival. In saving her, she had saved him too. The storm eventually passed, as all storms do. But the warmth that had returned to the mountain cabin remained, kindled by the love between an old lumberjack who'd lost everything and a little girl who'd called him daddy. And in the spring, when the snow melted and the wildflowers bloomed, 2 sets of footprints could be seen on the mountain paths, one large and steady, one small and trusting, walking side by side toward a future neither had expected, but both had desperately needed. Spring awakening. The trip to town had been necessary but difficult. Sheriff Wade listened to Eli's story with a furrowed brow, making calls to neighboring counties about missing children. But no one was looking for a dark-haired girl with violet eyes. No missing person reports matched her description. "What's your name, sweetheart?" the sheriff had asked gently. The girl pressed closer to Ellis's side, whispering so softly only he could hear, "Rose. My mama called me Rose." That was all she would say about her past. The sheriff promised to keep searching, but after weeks of inquiries leading nowhere, he pulled Eli aside. Sometimes, Sheriff Wade said quietly, kids end up in the woods because someone put them there. Someone who didn't want them found. You understand what I'm saying? Ellis's jaw tightened. He understood all too well. The legal matters took time, background checks, home visits from a weary social worker who had to snowshoe up the mountain, and paperwork that seemed endless for a man he preferred working with his hands over using a pen. But Eli persisted with a determination that surprised even himself. By the time the crocuses pushed through the melting snow, it was official. Rose Turner had a legal guardian and a real home. The change in seasons brought changes to the cabin too. Eli cleared out the small room he'd used for storage, transforming it into a bedroom fit for a little girl. He built her a bed from pine logs, sanded smooth as silk. At the general store in town, he stood bewildered before bolts of fabric until Mrs. Henderson took pity on him and helped him choose a cheerful yellow print for curtains. Rose bloomed like her namesake flower. Although she was still quiet by nature, words came easier to her now. She helped Eli in the garden, her small hands patting soil around the tomato seedlings. She learned to identify the different trees by their bark and leaves, to spot deer tracks in the mud, and to whistle like the mountain birds. But the nightmares came too. Some nights, Eli would wake to her terrified cries. He'd find her huddled in her bed, clutching her doll, tears streaming down her face. "The cold is coming back," she sobbed. "It's so cold, and I can't find my way." Eli would gather her in his arms, wrapping them both in Martha's star quilt, and rock her by the dying fire. "You're not lost anymore," he'd whisper. "You're home. I've got you, Rose. Daddy's got you." Slowly, the nightmares faded, though she never spoke of what had driven her into the woods that winter day. Summer arrived in a rush of green. Eli taught Rose to fish in the river, where he'd found her footprints, transforming that place of near tragedy into one of joy. She squealed with delight when she caught her first trout, a tiny thing they threw back with ceremony. "Everything deserves a second chance," Eli told her, watching the fish disappear into the current. Rose looked up at him with those wise violet eyes. "Like us?" "Yeah, sweetheart. Like us." They picked huckleberries on the mountain slopes, Rose's face and fingers staining purple from the ones that didn't make it into the bucket. Eli taught her which mushrooms were safe to eat and which to avoid, how to move quietly through the forest without startling the wildlife, and how to read the weather in the clouds. In the evenings, after dinner, he'd tell her stories. Some were tales his own grandfather had told him about the old days. Others were about Martha, how they'd met at a barn dance, how she'd insisted on helping him build the cabin despite never having held a hammer before, and how she could make anything grow in their garden. "Was she pretty?" Rose asked one night. "Beautiful," Eli said, pulling out a faded photograph from his wallet. "Inside and out, she would have deeply loved you." Rose studied the picture of the woman with a gentle smile and silver-streaked hair. "I think she sent me to you." Ellis's throat tightened. "Maybe she did, little one. Maybe she did." As autumn painted the mountains gold and crimson, they prepared for winter together. Rose helped stack firewood, her small arms carrying what she could. She learned to can preserves and store vegetables in the root cellar. The approaching cold no longer frightened her. She had a warm home now, and someone who would never let her face the snow alone. One October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky pink and orange, Rose slipped her hand into Eli's calloused one. "Daddy?" she said quietly. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." She was quiet for a long moment, gathering courage. "My first daddy, he didn't want me. Said I was too much trouble. He drove me to the forest and told me to get out. Said someone else could deal with me." Ellis's hand tightened around hers, rage and sorrow warring in his chest. But he kept his voice gentle. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. That wasn't right. That wasn't your fault." "I know," she said, and he was struck by the strength in her small voice. "Because you want me. You came looking for me. And I always will," Eli promised. "No matter what." Rose leaned against his side, and they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The first snow would come soon, but the cabin was ready. The woodpile was high, the pantry was full, and Martha's star quilt was clean and waiting. But more than that, the cabin was full of something that had been missing for too long: laughter, purpose, and love. The sound of small feet running across wooden floors. Crayon drawings stuck to the refrigerator. A child's voice called Daddy. When she spotted a deer at the forest edge. When she spotted a deer at the forest edge, a child's voice called out, "Daddy." In the deepest cold, unexpected warmth can find its way in. Sometimes what seems like an ending is really a beginning. Sometimes a man who never had the chance to be a father and a girl who was discarded, as if she were worthless, can save one another. As the first snowflakes of the new winter began to fall, Eli and Rose went inside their warm cabin together. home, family. They rediscovered their love in the most unexpected way. The mountains had brought them together, and they would keep them safe. And somewhere, perhaps, Martha was smiling. The first winter together. The blizzard hit 3 days before Christmas. It was nothing like the storm that had brought Rose to him. This one arrived with a warning. The sky growing heavy and dark, the animals restless. Eli had lived through enough Montana winters to read the signs. Big one coming, he told Rose as they secured the shutters. Might be snowed in for a while. To his relief, she didn't look frightened. Instead, she helped him with the preparations, checking their supplies and bringing in extra firewood. She'd learned to trust that walls and warmth would hold against the cold. They spent the storm days in cozy productivity. Eli taught Rose to play checkers on a board he'd carved years ago. She taught him the clapping games she remembered from before, though some of the words made her sad. They baked bread in the old cast-iron stove, filling the cabin with warmth and yeasty comfort. On the third night, as wind rattled the windows, Rose asked, "Can we have a Christmas tree?" Eli's hand stilled on the wooden toy he was whittling, a surprise for her. He and Martha had always had a tree, but since her passing, he'd let the holiday slide by unnoticed. "Don't see why not," he said. "Once the storm subsides, he plans to celebrate." When the skies finally cleared, they ventured out into a world that had been transformed. Snow lay thick and pristine, turning the familiar forest into something magical. Rose's eyes sparkled as she helped Eli cut a small pine, her cheeks red with cold and excitement. They decorated it with strings of popcorn and cranberries, paper stars Rose cut with Martha's old scissors, and a few precious glass ornaments from the attic. Eli lifted Rose onto his shoulders to place a carved wooden angel on top, one Martha had treasured. "It's beautiful," Rose breathed, and Eli had to agree. The cabin hadn't seen such light in years. On Christmas morning, Rose found the wooden horse Eli had carved, along with a new dress Mrs. Henderson had helped him order from the catalog. But her favorite gift was a small leather journal. Eli gruffly said, "I thought you might like to draw or write in it. Sometimes it helps to put things down on paper." Rose hugged the stuffed animal to her chest, then embraced her father. "I love you, Daddy." He had waited a lifetime to hear those words. "I love you too, Rose." Martha sewed more stars in that quilt than any other. The deep cold of January caused the logs in the cabin walls to crack violently like gunshots in the night. However, the cabin was warm, and Rose no longer woke up crying out in the snow. Instead, she'd pad out to find Eli reading by the fire and curl up against his side. "Tell me about when you were little," she'd request, and Eli would reach back through the years to find stories of a boyhood spent in these same mountains. One particularly cold morning, they woke to find ice crystals had formed on the inside of the windows, creating elaborate patterns like frozen gardens. Rose traced them with one finger, wonder in her eyes. "Jack Frost came visiting," Eli told her. "He used to tell me he was an artist, painting winter pictures for anyone who'd look. Is he friendly? He can be friendly enough, provided that you respect winter and prepare yourself appropriately. It's when folks forget that winter has teeth that trouble comes." Rose nodded solemnly. She knew about winter's teeth. February arrived with a surprise. Eli had gone to check his trap lines, leaving Rose safe by the fire with strict instructions not to open the door to anyone. But when he returned, he found her at the window, pointing excitedly. "Daddy, look, visitors." A doe and her yearling stood at the edge of the clearing, pawing through the snow for the grain Eli sometimes scattered. Rose watched, enchanted, as they ate. Eli mused that it was the same pair that had come last winter. Martha used to say they brought good luck. "Do you think Mayor Martha thinks she watches us?" Rose asked quietly. Eli considered his words carefully. I think love doesn't just disappear when someone goes. It stays around, warming the cold spots, sending help when we need it most. Consider the act of introducing a young girl to an elderly man who had lost the ability to smile. Rose smiled then, that rare, precious smile that transformed her serious little face. Sending a father figure to a girl in need was also an act of kindness. They watched the deer until they bounded back into the forest, white tails flashing. As March brought the first hints of spring, longer days, and the sound of water running beneath ice, they received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Wade Snow showed up to the cabin, his face grim. I need to talk to you alone, Eli. Eli sent Rose to her room with her journal and crayons, then faced the sheriff. What is it? I received a call from someone in Idaho. The man reported his daughter missing about a year ago. The description matches Rose. Eli's heart became as cold as any winter storm. And? The man's got a record. Domestic violence. Child endangerment. He relinquished custody of Rose to her mother 3 years ago. Mama died in a car accident last winter, and he took the girl from her foster home. Nobody's seen him since he left Idaho. He dumped her, Eli said flatly. He abandoned her to perish in the snow. That's what I figure. The question is, what do we do about it? Eli looked toward Rose's room, where he could hear her humming softly. He threw her away. As far as I'm concerned, he's got no claim. Sheriff Wade nodded slowly. Maybe the state of Idaho feels different. Maybe they want to investigate. Or I might forget to return their call, and that paperwork gets lost in my cluttered office. Happens sometimes, you know. Occasionally, misplacement occurs. Their eyes met in understanding. You're a wonderful man, Wade. The little girl deserves a real father. It seems to me she's got one. The sheriff stood to leave. Take care of her, Eli. I will protect her with my life. That night, as Eli tucked Rose into bed, she surprised him by asking, Am I staying forever? Something in her tone told him she'd heard more than he'd realized. Eli sat on the edge of her bed, taking her small hands in his. Forever and a day, he promised. This residence is your home. I'm your daddy. Nothing and no one will change that. Could someone possibly come in search of you? Even then, mountains look after their own, Rose. And you're one of us now. She studied his weathered face in the lamplight, then nodded, satisfied. Okay, Daddy. Forever and a day had passed since his disappearance. As she drifted off to sleep, Eli stood watch by her window, looking out at the dark forest. Somewhere out, there was a man who'd thrown away the most precious gift imaginable. But his loss was Eli's salvation. The winter was ending, but their story was just beginning. And Eli Turner, who'd thought his heart had been buried with Martha, found it beating strong and sure with a father's fierce love. Spring would come again, as it always did. But this time, it would find the Turner cabin ready, not just with supplies and preparations, but with hope, healing, and the unbreakable bond between a man who'd longed to be a father and the daughter who'd chosen him. In saving each other, they'd found themselves. And that was the greatest gift of all. 5 years later, the school bus couldn't make it up the mountain road. So every morning, Eli drove Rose down in his old pickup truck. This particular September morning held the crisp promise of autumn, and 12-year-old Rose sat beside him, braiding her long, dark hair. Is Rose feeling nervous about the upcoming presentation? Eli asked, glancing at the poster board in the truck bed. A little. Rose secured her braid with a rubber band. But Mrs. Patterson said personal history projects are about sharing what matters to us. And the subject matters. The project was titled My Family Tree, and Rose had worked on it for weeks. Instead of a traditional tree, she'd drawn a mountain landscape. At the base was a small figure labeled Me Lost, and at the summit stood two figures, Daddy Eli and Mama Martha, watching over us. Pressed wildflowers and tiny drawings depicting their shared life decorated the path between them. Eli had told her, "It's perfect," when she showed it to him. Martha would be proud. At the school, Rose gave him a quick hug before joining her friends. Eli watched her get taller now, confident, no longer the silent waif he'd carried from the snow.